Annabelle Williams. You are a journalist and editor who specializes in investing, economics, and consumer affairs. Previously, you were a columnist at the Times, and you are often invited on live TV, radio, and panel debates to talk about finance and inequality between genders. And today, we are here to speak about your new book, Why Women Are Poorer Than Men and What Can We Do About It. Annabelle, thank you so much for being here today.
That's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Annabelle, I have a daughter, and I want my daughter to have as much opportunity as any man. And you just wrote this book explaining why women are getting paid less than men. So, I think this is a topic that, even though inequality is decreasing, it needs to be brought up on and on because it's gonna take a long time before my daughter have equal opportunity as any man for no other reason than being a woman. So I wonder, Annabelle, if we could start by you telling us a little bit about your background. How is it that you became a journalist?
Sure. I always wanted to be a journalist, and finance wasn't something that initially appealed to me. I didn't have much exposure to the industry. I don't have any family members that work in money or finance. But around the time of the financial crisis, it really brought news about the stock market and business from the back pages of the newspapers to the front page, and suddenly it became relevant to ordinary people. That was a period that really piqued my interest in kind of how money and finance, and I guess the system, so to speak, how that works. Basically started out as an investment reporter, and I've been a journalist 15 years. I've covered personal investing and global stock markets for professional investors too, and I'm really interested in macroeconomics. The interest in this book really came from when I started out in the industry. I was shocked by how male it was. And I know that people say, finance is quite a male industry. At asset managers and insurers and accountants, it's predominantly male workforce in London, at least. But I was just so shocked at how the visible women were often, the secretaries, the receptionists at the office, and not the people I was interviewing. At the same time, when I received press releases about women and finance, it was always in the context of women don't invest very much because women don't like risk. We need to get women to overcome their fears of investing and risk and put their money to work in the stock market. Fine, but when I read this, I just think, which women don't like risk? And to me, it just seemed patently obvious that a lot of women don't invest in the stock market because they don't have access to information about it, or they lack the money. We know that it tends to be men that have more of the highest paying jobs. That's obviously changed a lot, but on the whole, a lot of women tend to be more focused on household finances and are less able to look at the big picture, I think. And I would speak to people about why women don't like risk, and they would also conflate it with women in leadership and say, well, women running companies and women running countries are more risk averse. And I don't think that there has been enough women running countries or states for us to even draw conclusions about what female leaders are like at that level. I mean, this is basically where it all came from. That was the genesis for the book. And one other point I wanted to raise was that in the last few years, there's been lots of discussion about the pay gap. It's fantastic that that has been brought to the consciousness, but at the same time, economic inequality between the genders is about so much more than the pay gap, and the conversation has really got stuck about this issue of equal pay. In my book, I explore how women tend to have less money in old age, majority of the elderly poor all over the world, how social security and state budgets for welfare, they tend to be that spending goes towards women because we're more involved in caring. We have to work fewer hours because of unpaid caring responsibilities, so we take more of that money from the state. Women are sicker throughout their lives. We have pregnancy, so we make more visits to the doctor and so forth. There is just so many facets of kind of money. And, again, we can also look at, for example, women in business. We know that female entrepreneurs struggle to raise the capital for startup businesses. So globally, they would take basically one cent of every dollar that's given to small scale businesses. And again, this is about perceptions about what women are like with money. So that's really the genesis for the book.
Well, okay, you open your book with an explanation of why historically women have been denied access to wealth. So, can you tell us about some of those barriers that women continue facing? No, I mean, you started with women's right to vote, and then how it's just been how they struggle to even buy a house. So, can you take us back to that part of why historically women have been denied to this access to wealth?
Sure. So, firstly, finance is a feminist issue. Um, Women's rights have always been about money, whether or not we recognise that or not. So, in England in 1918, women won the right to vote for the first time. Everybody knows that, but actually, it was only wealthier property owning women. Usually, they qualified through their husbands, not themselves. They were the only people who were allowed to vote. Poorer women had to wait until 20 years later, 10 years later. So access to money determined what women could do hundreds of years ago, and it still does today. What we have is historically, under the British and American system, women couldn't have property because they were property. It was a concept called coverture, where women first belonged to their fathers and then they belonged to their husbands. So we were assets. And when a woman got married, all of her property and possessions belonged to her husband. Men couldn't make agreements, legal agreements with their wives, because it would be like making an agreement with himself. He was part of her. This then, this is like a medieval idea, but it's basically carried on, and it's been written into law in different ways. So around the world, there are various ways that this has happened. So in England until 1950, the definition of somebody too incapacitated to deal with money was any infant, lunatic, adult woman, or or criminal. And like ranking women alongside, fools was just considered totally normal. In Ireland, women couldn't own property independently until 1976. So they were prevented from having an asset that would rise in value. 1976, my mother's Irish, and she would have been well into her 20s before that changed. There was no concept that women should be able to look after themselves. Interestingly, North America actually was quicker to grant women financial rights than other places in the world, and Britain and the rest of the world lagged behind. That's because America's being this country of explorers with the ever receding frontiers. Women were often left alone as men went off to explore the country, and they then were granted rights quite early on, so from the early 18th century onwards, to trade, do business with other people, and enter into legal agreements and property. But even so, over the years, perceptions about what women should and shouldn't be doing have changed. So what really happened was it was more in the last century or so, after the war, there was this real need for people to go back to kind of this ideal of a nuclear family, women at home. So a lot of women had been out in the workforce, and then they retreated back into the home. And, we know that during kind of the 50s, people bedecked their homes in beautiful, cheerful colours. Women became denied access to a lot of the rights that they'd had. There were more laws cropped up about where women could and couldn't work. Like women couldn't work in bowling alleys in some states. Women couldn't work as shoe shiners. These were places where in the American mindset, women might come into contact with unsuitable men. In England, a woman could be banned from buying a drink in the bar in the pub until the middle of the 1980s. And that was because it was up to the pub landlord whether or not she should be able to spend her money in these male establishments. There are all of these little ways in which we've been denied access to money historically, and that has ramifications today.
Wow, this seems like you are talking about some kind of weird novel or it's some dystopian book. This is incredible that we still hear about this, and we are only talking about the Western world, where supposedly we have made the most advances. We don't even want to think about some of the countries that are still backwards and where women are still considered as property. Let me ask you. Uh, so we are making advances, and little by little, women are becoming more financially independent. I think more women now are finishing a college degree than men. So eventually, the labor market has to tip and give this equality to women. But where do you see the low hanging fruits? Where do you think that we can make the most progress toward equality?
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you say that there are more women graduating. So that's true. And what people don't realize is that around the world for about 30 years, women in general have been um, outperforming men educationally at almost every single level in almost every single subject. So when women go into the workplace, we're actually often overqualified and better qualified than men. That's a generalization, obviously. And I think it's really interesting that the myth persists that women become distracted from the labour market by motherhood. This was a key theme of Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In. She talks about how young women become distracted by the idea of motherhood sometimes before they've even found a partner or had babies. Actually, women are the majority of people who take part in adult education and workplace training. And we're 75% of those who do workplace training. And there are big initiatives, both in Britain and America, to try to get more men involved. Now, that really doesn't mesh with this idea of women being distracted. Actually, we're really engaged in our work. It's just that it isn't seen as part of the bigger picture. Now, in the 1970s, there was a really interesting idea that was come up with by an academic, and it was called the Peter Principle. And it says that every man rises to his level of incompetence. So, what it means is that in the workplace, you keep on being promoted until you get to a job where you're not good enough to get promoted any further. So you settle into a job that is just above your competency level. So in the 1970s, this was talking about men, and it is called the Peter Principle. Academics now suggest that we should be talking about something called the Paula Principle, which is every woman is sort of working, or many women are working at below their level of competence. And that's really interesting, I think, because often with women, when we talk about the pay gap, what we don't talk about is underemployment. So that's when women go back to the workforce, for example, after having a child, they often end up in a role that is below their skill level. Or when they do work, they often work part-time and they are underemployed. Usually, often there are many women who want to be more employed, want to work more hours and in a higher paying job, but they can't get into that because they're kind of burdened by the caring responsibilities, which even to this day, it falls primarily on the individual. It's not, childcare isn't seen as a state kind of, it's not seen as a government priority.
Wow. What do you think about governments now actively trying to reduce this inequality? For example, the government of Scotland, who just became the first in the world to make female products for free. And I don't even know how that works. I guess they can just go to the supermarket and pick it up for free. I have no idea. But do you think governments are making an effort to reduce this inequality or to bring a woman out of poverty?
Yeah, the Scotland example and the free period products is a really interesting one because what they've done is rather than coming up with a totally new system of distributing tampons, they've decided that, well, we already give away condoms for free to people who need them. Let's just use those existing places. So wherever people can get free condoms, like at family planning clinics, those who need them can now get free tampons. And it's a really great idea because it recognises that not everybody in society gets their condoms for free. A lot of people just buy them, but those who need to have a place where they can go. This is just one example of how governments can use existing structures to kind of resolve things. So I'll give you an example. I've mentioned childcare a couple of times because, really the motherhood thing is kind of pinpointed as one of the key barriers. Like there's a Netflix documentary about the pay gap, and it has got people like Hillary Clinton speaking, and they describe the pay gap as the motherhood penalty rather than a gender pay gap. It's true to an extent, and one of the ways that this could be solved is that governments look at spending on roads, bridges, infrastructure, and kind of rudimentary healthcare as essential spending for the economy. So it's classed as infrastructure. Without good roads and bridges, the economy wouldn't function. People wouldn't be able to get places and trade. But then at the same time, childcare is. It's really interesting that you mentioned Scotland, because what they have done with distributing free period products is they've used the existing networks that they already have. So they've decided that everywhere that people can get free condoms, there are also going to be places where people who need them can pick up free tampons and pads. And I think this is really excellent, because not just because it uses the existing distribution network, but it acknowledges that not everybody in society is going to want and take free condoms. Most people just buy them. But for those who need them, there's a place where they can go. And it's exactly the same with tampons. Not everybody is going to want to take them for free. There are so many other ways in which governments and workplaces and employers can basically tweak existing structures just to make them more favourable to gender equality. For example, governments spend money on essential infrastructure to keep their economies going. Essential infrastructure is roads, schools, bridges, ports, that kind of thing. These are all things that society needs to get people from A to B, to keep trade happening and people moving around the economy. But at the same time, childcare is seen as something that the individual has to bear the cost of themselves. We're solely responsible for the cost of childcare. Why isn't childcare categorised as essential infrastructure spending, as it's as vital to the economy and to people's ability to go out to work as roads and bridges and hospitals and transport? It doesn't make any sense that there's this discrepancy. And a similar issue is with female small business owners can expense the travel from female small business owners can expense the travel to a business meeting as a tax deductible expense, but you can't then deduct the cost of the childminder. This is just a small discrepancy. It doesn't make any sense that one is allowable for tax purposes and then the other isn't. When President Obama came into power, he changed the law so that it's no longer unlawful for federal employees to discuss their pay with each other. And that increases transparency. This kind of thing should be standard everywhere. Similarly, in some states in America, it's unlawful for employers to ask people about their previous pay at a job interview. This is because if somebody has been underpaid in a previous job for whatever reason, race, ageism, any kind of discrimination, basing then future pay on the previous salary package basically risks carrying that discrimination forward. Kind of changing this and just changing the law to say it's unlawful for employers to discuss previous pay. The salary for any job should be based on the skills and the experience involved. This isn't like rewriting the rule book. This is a small change to an existing structure. that we could do, and it doesn't just benefit women, it benefits anybody that faces economic inequality for unfair reasons.
Wow. Okay. I have to tell you, I am a fanatic about the stock market. It's just like other men watch hockey and soccer and whatever. I watch the business news all the time. And when I go to a cocktail party, that somehow a group of men go into a little corner and they start talking about which stock they are buying, which they are selling. And most of the time, they cannot agree with each other. I mean, I can never agree with my friends on what to buy and what to sell. But it is our perception, my perception at least, that this is not a topic that interests women. I mean, I have tried as much as possible to bring a woman into the conversation and say, hey, what do you think about the latest marijuana stock or I don't know, Bitcoin or whatever? And, it's just a sample of one, so maybe but I go to many cocktail parties and I see that as something recurrent. So I wonder if it's just my perception or women in general are just not that interested into the stock market.
This is a really interesting discussion to be having, and that is because there's a chapter in my book devoted to the lack of women in economics, professional economics. It's really interesting that so girls outnumber boys in terms of university degrees in the UK and sorry, can I start that again?
Sure,
Yeah, I'm just a bit thrown. I'm gonna turn. Can I turn my camera off?
sure, please.
Yeah, I'm just a bit thrown by that. Um, this is a really interesting conversation to be having because there's a chapter in my book where I deal with girls being underrepresented in economics studies at university level and also in professional economics. So there's a really unusual trend, which is where girls outnumber the number of boys studying subjects like biology, life sciences. In the UK, there are more girls studying veterinary science and medicine, and mathematics too. But there are far fewer girls studying economics at university level. And then what happens is that the further up the chain you go in economics, particularly, women are very much underrepresented. Um, when you go to lectures about economics, the lecturer will be quoting from a book that's written by a man. The great economists that are taught to all students are predominantly men. There's a real dearth of women in this in economics, basically, and that kind of translates then into a lack of women in other areas of finance, so investing or asset markets and so forth. Nobody really knows why this is. To me, it's a little bit like the weight section at the gym. Like, there's no reason why that part of the gym is sort of seen as a male only area where few women venture into, but we've got this mindset that it is just for boys. Um, I think that the way around it is twofold. So, to change perceptions about what the stock market is, the first question that I'm always asked as a financial journalist is um, I don't want to invest because it's too much like gambling. There's a big difference between gambling and investment, and that's this that with gambling, there tends to be a binary outcome. So if you place a bet on a horse or buy a lottery ticket, you either win or lose. But if you buy shares in Amazon, for example, and then you own them or hold them, as the industry jargon is, if you hold those shares then for 5 years, there's unlikely to be a binary outcome of you either winning or losing. There'll be a range of outcomes. The shares might go up, they might go down, depending on when you sell them. You might make a profit or a loss. Anything could happen, basically. And I think that's really important because we know that for whatever reason, kind of gambling is more of a male activity. We know that women tend to be acutely focused on short-term financial needs and household management. And because of that, they're going to be less keen on kind of risking money in that way. So reframing it really from gambling to investment is a really important thing. And then the other thing is that, investment really is kind of shrouded in masculinity with its elitism and its jargon and macho connotations. It's really seen as something aggressive and competitive. Um, Actually, at its most basic, what investment is looking at the world we have today, thinking about how it might change, which companies are best positioned to kind of capitalize on that change, and then putting your money towards the kind of society that you want to see or expect to see. And a really great example of this is the IPO of Beyond Meat. So this is a purveyor of non-meat alternative burgers and sausages. And its IPO was when it went onto the stock market and you could buy shares in it for the first time. This is a real example of how society is changing. And the question is, do you want to buy shares in Beyond Meat? Will it change the world, or will somebody else do fake meat even better? Will Amazon buy Beyond Meat? These are all the questions that you want to ask yourself to really reframe investment as not something that's out there and to do with computers and whiz kids, but something that's real and around you in the world.
Right, right. Okay, another topic is you mentioned not too long ago that when for venture capitalists that there is this great disparity between money given to men to start their own enterprises and woman money given to women. And I had in my podcast a woman venture capitalist, and she tells me that she wants to give her money to woman to come with enterprise ideas. And what she tells me is that when a man is asking for money, they outright lie to her face, and they know that she knows that they are lying, and they continue lying, just painting this rosy picture of how much money they're gonna make and how successful the company is gonna be, etc., etc. And when a female comes to ask for money, she just presents the truth, or she maybe undersells herself, and then she has this debate. Okay, should I give the money to this guy who is lying to me, but he seems like full of optimism, or this woman who is telling me the truth but is not painting a rosy picture of where this company could go? And she debates a lot with that, but I guess it's in the way that the men are just overselling and the women are being a little bit more prudent. And I don't know how much of that is true or false, but it seems to make sense in my head.
Yeah, so again, this is a really interesting topic, and it goes back to whether women are socialized into looking at themselves in a particular way, um, or whether it's the way that we look at women. So I'll give you an example. The research shows basically that when women go into the boardroom to pitch for business, pitch for capital for their startup businesses, the questions they are asked tend to be different to those that are asked to male founders. Women are asked more about the prospects for mitigating risk to their businesses. Men tend to be asked more about the potential for their businesses. So immediately there's a perception that for women there is risk and for men there is potential. And researchers have looked into whether this is about women running more kind of female businesses in health or leisure, and that isn't the case. It's irrespective of what kind of business people are pitching. So in a way, it could be that women are responding to the questions that they've received from other investors. But then there's also in speech psychology, there's this whole field of gender difference in the way that groups with different powers speak. And what we know is that men, on average, are more likely to state openly and boast about their accomplishments, even when they aren't asked. And when they are asked about past achievements, will tend to misremember them as being better than they were. And then by contrast, women tend not to overstate their accomplishments. If anything, they'll understate them. And then if you ask them about performance on a test that they did a year ago, for example, they will tend to misremember and underrepresent how well they went. And it's kind of chicken and egg. It's like women are penalized professionally for boasting. They're not seen as likable. So actually, it's socially intelligent to kind of hold back and to understate how good you are if you're a woman. That's about fitting in and being liked. Yeah, there's just a really interesting conversation that we to have around this and the way women are assessed in the boardroom, but also the way that we present ourselves. And I don't think there's a clear answer there.
Right. Okay. Well, I can say that women are making huge strides. I mean, not too long ago, Whitney Wolf Herd became the youngest female CEO, and she was now her net worth is $1.6 billion, I believe. I'm not sure. We have Kelly Jenner, the one from the Kardashian. Also, she's 21, 22, and she's a billionaire from her own whatever beauty products. And we got Oprah Winfrey. We got what is it? Sarah, the one who created Spanx. This Sarah Berkeley, I believe. So I mean, and Jennifer Fraser from Citigroup, the female CEO of a big bank institution. So I think women, little by little, maybe here and there, they are becoming that role model that a little girl uh, could see and be inspired to get into business. So no longer will be, oh, I have never seen a female billionaire. No, there's now a few examples. There are a few examples of female CEOs, and hopefully that will increase the amount of women who go into business and have the belief that they can do it themselves.
Absolutely. And there's a real cultural element to this. So we're talking from a Western European and American perspective where women are underrepresented in these areas. But if you look to the East, to China, for example, um, a greater proportion of the country's millionaires are women compared, and successful business leaders are women compared to other parts of the world. Equally, the first woman to win the highest honor in mathematics, the Field Prize, which is like the Nobel Prize. The first woman to win that was from Iran, and it was no surprise to anybody in mathematics that it would come from there because there was so much more of a tradition of gender equality in mathematical and hard sciences in these countries. It's like if you talk to a group of school children from India, they would have less of a concept that there are, art subjects for girls to study and sciences and engineering for boys to study. It's far more gender equal. And I think because of this trend and globalization, in future, in 20 years, when we look at the world's billionaires and millionaires, a greater proportion of them will be women and they will be self-made business women from other parts of the world.
Wow. Okay. So, Annabelle, this is an amazing conversation. Let me ask you, let's say I have a daughter. Let's say my daughter, and she's already an adult, but let's say my daughter is only 18 and she will say, Annabelle, I read about your book. What should I do professionally in order to be successful in finance? What would you say to my daughter?
I'd say that girls tend to make choices about their career path and what to study based on societal norms rather than thoughts about their future economic security. I mean, that's a generalization, but what parents can really do is talk to their children about what specific jobs actually involved and really emphasize that there isn't a type of person that goes into certain areas. So what the research shows is one of the reasons that women don't go into like coding, for example, as much as boys, is because they've got a perception that there's a type, and they basically don't want to be going to university and be surrounded by these boring nerd geeks with no social skills. And, you know, it's a stereotype, and we know that isn't actually the case. Really talk to children about how, have a growth mindset. Anybody can accomplish anything. It isn't so much about innate talent as it is about hard work and focus. And equally, that all sorts of people go into different areas. And what do these jobs really involve? Like engineering, that's about food and nutrition as much as it is about oil rigs, for example. These are really important conversations to be having with young people. And the other thing, the other impediment to young women today is really the beauty pressure and the physical scrutiny that they are under. Boys are under this as well, but there's emerging research. There was a big study of 50,000 children from 22 countries. And it found that girls tend not to put their hand up in class or be called on because they're worried about their physical appearance. There are girls who spend hours getting ready for a job interview because they're worried about physical scrutiny. Really kind of trying to counter that message at home and emphasize that it's not about the appearance so much as what you say and the things that you do. These are all really important traits, I think, to really nurture in young people.
Right. Okay, Annabelle, the last question is, can you please tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people either buy it and follow you as well, because you're doing a lot of amazing work?
My book is called Why Women Are Poorer Than Men and What You Can Do About It by Annabelle Williams. That's me. And you can find me on Twitter at Talk to Annabelle and on Instagram at Ms. Annabelle Williams.
Annabelle, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.